Good morning, and thank you for joining me on the path to liberty. It's Monday, June 14th, 2021. And on this episode, I've got an update on efforts to use the 10th Amendment to protect the Second Amendment from federal overreach, which is constant. We now have 4 states getting on the board, getting the ball rolling with laws on the books in Missouri as of Saturday. Arizona, Montana, and Idaho. Plus, I'm going to quickly mention 3 others that are getting close to the finish line on some first steps. In Texas, there's a bill on the governor's desk. A bill has passed both houses in New Hampshire, and then one in Wisconsin. But first of all, before getting to that, my name is Michael Bolden. We broadcast live every Monday, Wednesday, and Friday at 9:30 a.m. Pacific Time from here in my home office and studio in downtown Los Angeles for the 10th Amendment Center. Our show homepage has everything you need to follow this program. All the archives for about 3 years now. On individual episodes like this one, I'm going to link to stuff that I'm talking about so you can read and learn more on your own time, because I'm just scratching the surface and giving you an overview, and I hope that you're encouraged to do more research on your own time. You can find all the different platforms we're on. We live stream on the mainstream ones like YouTube and Facebook and Twitch and Twitter. We also have the archive uploaded to places like Gab TV and MeWe and Minds and Brighteon and BitChute and BitTube and Hyper and all over the place. We have the audio-only podcast edition on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, Stitcher, Podbean, and elsewhere. And you can even find our membership program where you can put your financial faith behind our work for as little as $2 a month, and we make it go a long, long way in support of the Constitution and liberty. Again, the show homepage is 10thamendmentcenter.com/path to liberty, all spelled out. And speaking of members, I want to say a quick, very brief thank you, my extreme gratitude to a small handful of the people who have joined us recently as members. There's John in Pennsylvania, Edna in Florida, Justin in Tennessee, Doug in North Carolina, Luke in Texas. I have not named everybody, and I'm so grateful for you putting your financial faith behind our work. Thank you so much. And a quick hello to everyone out in the live chat while we allow people another moment or so to get notifications to join us in the live stream. There's Liberty Revolutionary, Bob Landry, Dan Warsaw, Tim Martin, Dixie Strongclay, Kent, Tyler, Richard, Truth, Money, and Freedom Podcast. Good to see you. Great work there in Missouri to Chicken Man and everyone else. I appreciate you spending some time with me today, but let's get right to the information. And for those of you who've been following our work for a long time, you know for sure that Missouri, after 8 years of work, finally got the Second Amendment Preservation Act passed into law. It was signed by the governor on Saturday. There was a live stream of that event. We published a report on it. Here's just a brief overview, some highlights from Mike Meharry's reporting on this. He says, after 8 years of tireless effort by dedicated grassroots activists, this was on Saturday, June 12th, seriously, 8 years of incredibly hard work. Not everybody was involved in it for 8 years. Some were for 2 or 3. And some people came in at the end and helped push it over the top. It doesn't matter whether you put in 1 day of effort or 1,000 days or way more. Everyone has been an important piece of that puzzle, and we should be very grateful to the people in Missouri for setting a new, strong foundation for liberty going forward, for the right to keep and bear arms. Here again to Mike Meharry says, today, Missouri ended state and local enforcement of a wide range of federal gun control measures, past, present, and future. And I'm not going to go into the details of why this is so important, but the short version is that the federal government relies on state and local law enforcement, state and local agencies to carry out most federal programs. The ATF, for example, has somewhere around 5,000 and 6,000 employees for the entire country. About a third of them are in administration, and because I went to government-run school, my math is terrible. I guess that leaves us about 3,500 or so employees for the whole country, and they have a workload capacity. Those of you who run businesses realize that when you rely on person power to get things done, the amount of people that you can afford to employ really has a huge impact on how much work that gets done. So the ATF, on a year-to-year basis, can close somewhere between 8,000 and 10,000 cases for the entire country. And that's with support of state and local law enforcement. As soon as they start, the state by state, if dominoes start falling like this, that number is going to go down. And even if they double, they've tried to increase the size of the agency, but it always runs into roadblocks. And of course, that'll be something that they try to do over time, but we don't need to help them do the dirty deeds in our own states for the time being. We can figure out how to deal with that later on. So when they can only get 8 to 10,000 cases closed, think of it this way. If there were 10 or 11 or 12 million undocumented short-barreled shotguns in violation of the National Firearms Act of 1934, which shouldn't even exist in the first place, there is zero chance that the federal government would be able to really make a dent in that through enforcement measures without assistance from state and local law enforcement. So when a state like Missouri starts withdrawing support, just like we've seen done on cannabis, on marijuana, on hemp, on CBD, on immigration, we know that this has a huge impact on the federal government's ability to continue enforcement. And I'm rambling on that. Let's go back to Meharry's report. He says, with Governor Mike Parson's signature, this happened Saturday afternoon, on the Second Amendment Preservation Act, or SAPPA, Missouri took an important step toward ending federal acts that infringe on the right to keep and bear arms within the state. And here's the new law, sponsored by Jared Taylor. There's also co-sponsors and companion bills that were filed and carried by Bishop Davidson and Eric Burleson on the Senate side. Mike says, the new law bans any entity or person, including any public officer or employee of the state and its political subdivision, so any part of the state, from enforcing any past, present, or future federal acts, laws, executive orders, administrative orders, court orders, rules, regulations, statutes, or ordinances that infringe on the right to keep and bear arms. That is a huge swath. It's not everything. And we're going to address what happens now. What's next? I'm going to talk about that in just a moment and cover some other states. Burleson said, what we're doing today is taking a stand against a tyrannical federal government. Burleson has done a very good job on this, carrying it the last few years. I don't know, maybe 3-4 years, he's been the lead sponsor on the Senate side after a number of efforts had tried and failed in the past. It was originally filed by Senator Brian Nieves, who actually tore his NRA card from my memory in 2013 or so on the floor of the state Senate in Missouri because they were so aggressive in lobbying against this. They've always hated these 10th Amendment approach bills. He says, we are telling the president he can go pound sand. And it should be all of them because they are all enforcing federal gun control in violation of the Constitution. And here's Parsons. Parsons, I mean, he's a governor, so I don't like him. I don't like any of these governors, but he had some good things to say. And here's what he said. It's our job to protect the Second Amendment. You can't rely just on federal judges. Now, he didn't say this, but you can't rely on federal judges to limit federal power. You can't rely on a federal executive branch to limit federal power. You can't rely on federal congressional people, federal politicians to limit their own power. You have to have something outside of federal power to limit federal power. James Madison in Federalist 48, for example, said, just a mere demarcation on parchment of the limits of power is not a sufficient guard. So just putting it on paper and then hoping that the feds limit their own power is a bad choice. That's what's led to where we are today, the largest government in the history of the world. And Parsons right. He was right. It is absolutely their duty. They take an oath to the Constitution for the United States in Missouri and in every other state. So it is their job to follow their oath, no matter what anyone else outside the state has to say. He says the states are the firewall to the federal government. He sounds like a 10th Amendment guy there. Maybe he is. We'll see what happens when there's future actions, future follow-ups. Now, this is an 8-year process in Missouri, and I did an episode last month using the 10th Amendment to defend the Second Amendment, a brief history. I gave kind of an oral history going back all the way to the 90s and the work of the great Gary Marbett, in Montana, Ron Calzone in Missouri and elsewhere to talk about where this has come from, how it's built up, where we're going in the future. I encourage you to check out that episode. I will link to it in the show notes as well. And here's what's next in Missouri. At the end of the report, with SAPPA now in effect, how it plays out in practice will only be determined by human action. Just because you have a law on the books telling state government to stop enforcing federal acts, that doesn't change anything as long as everyone continues to comply with those federal acts. Let's be real here. He says, and the report says, those who are willing to exercise their rights, those who are willing to keep the pressure on law enforcement to ensure they're held accountable, because we know in every situation, in every state, on every issue, when you restrict law enforcement from enforcing a particular federal program, they continue to try to do it. It's much more difficult and it always cuts back, but they continue to try to find loopholes. So it's going to take some people being real watchdogs and following how every single enforcement action happens. Now, you can actually follow the ATF. They don't publish everything, but they do a lot of press releases when they talk about their busts and their prosecutions and things like that. And it'll point out this was done in association with this district attorney, this law enforcement agency, and the like. People have to really stay on top of this in Missouri and wherever these types of things pass. So people have to keep pressure on law enforcement to make sure they're held accountable, because there are accountability provisions in the Missouri Act that is in effect as of today or as of Saturday, and those who are willing to start taking the next steps to remove more gun control from Missouri state law in the coming years. Now, Missouri is basically, with this law on the books, they're saying we're not going to enforce federal gun control that, in essence, is not on the books in the state law. The ATF for every single state. Now, the ATF should not exist, but I am actually kind of grateful for all the great research they've put together for us, those of us who want to protect the right to keep and bear arms. They put out a very handy-dandy PDF document called Laws and Ordinances in the State of Blank. They have one for every single state, published laws and ordinances. It acts as a handy guide for what could or should be repealed in the future. Oh, I actually have it here in another tab here. It's called, what's the title here? State Laws and Published Ordinances, Missouri. Here, for example, is a glaring one. So Section 571.020 of Missouri statutes is possession of, and here's Section 1 or Subsection 1, Subsection 6, A, B, and C, any of the following in violation of federal law. So on Missouri law, they're actually replicating federal law. Why? Maybe they should just get rid of that stuff. And we'll talk about how Texas has a law on the governor, or a potential law on the governor's desk right now that will help address this in Missouri if they follow the leader on that one. So specifically in Missouri law, it says any of the following in violation of federal law. Possessing any of these items is a criminal act under state law as well. A machine gun. B, a short-barreled rifle or shotgun. C, a firearm silencer. Now, a silencer is a term of propaganda. It really is a sound suppressor. Nothing really silent. They like to do that because they want everyone to think that only sneaky criminals and diamond thieves are using these things, and it makes absolutely no sound. But these are basically NFA, National Firearms Act violations. Missouri is saying under state law it is also illegal as long as it's illegal under the federal law. Now, if Missouri is going to go out on their own and be strong and protect the Constitution, protect the Second Amendment, whether or not the federal government wants to protect the Second Amendment, they need to repeal this, for example. They could repeal even just 6C on sound suppressors. We know the feds are really aggressively wanting to get rid of these things. And if they just repeal it under state law, it creates a 1-2 punch automatically. As soon as you repeal it under state law, then not only do they stop enforcing on a state level, but because of the Second Amendment Preservation Act on the books today in Missouri, then they also stop helping the feds enforce the concurrent unconstitutional legislation. So that is a nice handy document for people in Missouri. I will link to that in the show notes at 10thamendmentcenter.com/path to liberty. A much shorter act, but the same type of effect was signed into law in April in Arizona by Governor Doug Ducey, who I also think is, well, he's been awful on a lot of stuff over the years, but there was a lot of pressure to get this done. And this was House Bill 2111, introduced by Representative Leo Biasucci. And there was actually a lot of law enforcement opposition in Arizona, just like there was in Missouri and Wyoming. And every state where this happens, or there's an effort on this, the number one opponents have always been law enforcement lobby groups who love to partner with their buddies in federal law enforcement and continue enforcing stuff that they should never be enforcing in the first place. But the new law bans, here from Mike Meharry again, bans the state and all political subdivisions of the state from, quote, using any personnel or financial resources to enforce, administer, or cooperate with any act, law, treaty, order, rule, or regulation of the United States government that is inconsistent with any law of the state of Arizona regarding the regulation of firearms. It's not in effect yet. It was signed, and it's 90 days after the legislature adjourned for the session. Sometime in August, I think it's like August 6th or so. We'll figure out exactly the right date. Maybe someone, Michael Gibbs or someone out there in Arizona, maybe Tim can help us figure this out. When does this go into effect so we can follow up on that as well? But it's the same process. And of course, in this report, we have a link to the ATF's handy guide for what needs to be repealed in Arizona. So this is step one. The state will no longer enforce federal acts that are not on the books in the state. You can't get it all done at the same time. Follow-up is start repealing the state laws as well, because as soon as you do that, then you're no longer enforcing the federal act at the same time. The third one I want to cover briefly is in Idaho. They got signed into law, Senate Bill 1205. This was a follow-up on a bill that we originally thought was really good in 2014 that was signed into law, but it turns out that as we learned some of the tricks that they use to make it look like they're doing great stuff, but they're really not, there were some loopholes in it. So I'm surprised. I was really surprised to see them work to tighten this up and clean it up a little bit. It's still only a first step forward, but it is an improvement on what's been on the books. Senate Bill 1205 was signed into law in May. It expands a prohibition on enforcement that was already on the books that was just going to be used for personnel. So they had a restriction on using personnel to help the federal government, but I think it was actually not just entities. So now they're talking about adding personnel, funds, or any other resources to enforce, administer, or support the enforcement of any executive order, agency order, treaty, law, rule, or regulation of the U.S. government upon a firearm, firearm component, firearm accessory, or ammunition. It covers a lot. If contrary to the provisions of Article 1, Section 11 of the Idaho State Constitution. And the Idaho State Constitution is actually pretty strong on this. It is not the strongest, but it's pretty solid. And you can see here, it prohibits any laws that impose licensure, registration, or special taxation on the ownership or possession of firearms or ammunition, nor shall any law permit the confiscation of firearms, except those actually used in the commission of a felony. So anything that doesn't violate that, but I think the issue that I have with the Idaho Act is that it leaves kind of an out. It leaves an out for law enforcement to continue doing what they're doing. What I like about the Arizona law specifically is it's so clean and straightforward. They say, look, you're no longer going to look and see whether or not you're going to enforce something based on federal law. You only look to the state constitution and state law. And if it's not there, you don't participate. Very straightforward. Here it says in Idaho, it's a similar approach, but it says, well, as long as it doesn't violate the state constitution. And that, in our experience, what we've seen over the years, doing this for many years now, is that a law enforcement agency or a specific agent will just say, well, it's not my job to determine whether or not something violates the state constitution. So I'm going to do what I think is best right now. I'm going to work with my partners in the ATF or in this joint terrorism task force or whatever they're doing. And I'm just going to do that. And if a judge says that we can no longer do this, if it goes to court, then of course we'll stop. And that, I think, is the problem with saying, if it violates either the state or the federal constitution, is you're allowing them the opportunity to kick the can over to a federal judge or a state judge even. Basically, wait for a court to give them permission to stop violating people's rights. Now, of course, every officer takes an oath to the Constitution for the United States. They take an oath to the Constitution for their own state, and they should be on their own conscience and on their oath that they're swearing. They should be following to the Constitution to the best of their ability, not waiting for someone else to tell them what to do like little automatons. So I just wanted to point that out on Idaho. There is a loophole that I think they should literally just say, look, we're not going to enforce this, and this like they do in Missouri on House Bill 85 or the Second Amendment Preservation Act, or the Arizona version, which is very similar, but I think a little bit even cleaner. Like if it is not specifically on the books in the state, we're not touching it. So maybe that would be the follow-up in Idaho. And then here in Montana, they did a line in the sand addressing only future federal gun control. Now, Idaho is also just for future stuff. Missouri and Arizona is covering anything ever. And now they just need to start repealing state laws. Missouri is very close to that as well. They also need to start repealing state laws that restrict the right to keep and bear arms. It's basically turning everyone to focus inward, closer to home, to protect the right to keep and bear arms. In Montana and Idaho, they're basically saying anything that's new from January of 2021 going on. And here, the new law, House Bill 258, which was signed by the governor in April, it looks like, April, prohibits police officers, state employees, and employees of any political subdivision of the state from enforcing, assisting in the enforcement, or otherwise cooperating in the enforcement of any new federal ban on firearms, magazine, or ammunition. Now, it says federal ban, but in the act, it specifically defines what they mean by federal ban, and it defines it as this: a federal law, executive order, rule, or regulation that is enacted, adopted, or becomes effective on or after January 1st, 2021, or even a new or more restrictive interpretation of an existing law that existed on January 1st, 2021. A quick aside, the reason that this is so important to include in the legislation is because what they do is they'll say, well, it's not a new act. They just did a new rulemaking procedure on sound suppressors or on bump stocks. And we're really talking about a federal act that was on the books in 1968, the Gun Control Act. And so therefore, because you have a restriction on enforcing anything new as of January 2021, well, that's an old act. So they recognize that that could be a loophole here, and they included this. I'm pretty sure it was Gary Marbut at Montana Shooting Sports Association that made that happen. But basically saying even if they reinterpret something that's been on the books in the past to make it more expansive, they're not going to help it. That infringes upon, calls in question, or prohibits, restricts, or requires individual licensure for or registration of the purchase, ownership, possession, transfer, or use of any firearm, any magazine, or other ammunition, feeding device, or other firearm accessory. It's a really solid starting point in Montana. Now, they do have to follow up. It's only every other year. They really need to follow up in the future and expand that, not just to what has been passed or expanded January of 2021. They need to start moving backwards. Maybe they can make it retroactive. We'll stop enforcing anything after 1986 or 1988 and then go back to 68 and 34. I mean, they can just add one at a time every session if we need to do that. I would like to see it all get done. I did cover how they really tried to do that in Montana. They took it all the way to the end, where law enforcement lobbied so aggressively against this that even in Montana, so they were going to do this and address basically all federal gun control on the books, past, present, and future, like in Missouri, like in Arizona, maybe even a little stronger than that. But it was lobbied against so strong that even in Montana, of all places, they killed the bill in committee. It never got out. It was done. And so they pushed it as far as they could, and then they used a parliamentary procedure and said, okay, well, we got to get something on the books. I covered how they actually did that process in an episode in April, Fortitude and Perseverance, a lesson on liberty in Montana. And it's a really great story. I hope you'll check that one out as well. I'll link to it in the show notes. And the Fortitude and Perseverance is a quote from Samuel Adams, the great father of the American Revolution, writing as Candidus in the Boston Gazette. This was the mouthpiece of the Sons of Liberty in Boston. This is in 1771. And he pointed out, and I think this is the mentality we have to take on all of these efforts in all of these states, even the stronger ones versus the lesser ones. Every step is a step forward, but we're nowhere close to being finished. Not in Missouri, not in Arizona, not in Montana, not in Idaho. Not anywhere. This is just getting the ball rolling. And here's how Samuel Adams put it. He said, instead of sitting down satisfied with the efforts we have already made, which is the wish of our enemies, the necessity of the times more than ever calls for our utmost circumspection, deliberation, fortitude, and perseverance. So that's Samuel Adams reminding us that no matter what we get done, we have to keep pushing on for liberty, because the enemies of liberty want us to be happy with what we've got so they can start chipping away at that again. Or just that's the new status quo and they're happy enforcing all the other garbage. Now, I mentioned Texas, and there is a bill on the desk of the governor in Texas, House Bill 957, which we can actually use. I mean, it's a much narrower approach, and I'll explain this in just a moment. It's a very narrow bill, but it is very good at the same time, dealing with sound suppressors. And this, I think, can be useful in helping us deal with the Missouri state laws on the books, where they specifically say if the feds say you can't have a machine gun, a short-barreled rifle or shotgun, or a sound suppressor, a firearm silencer, the state makes that illegal as well. Well, in Texas, Representative Tom Oliverson, I apologize if I get this wrong, he's been doing great work on this, pushing forward. There's been some other bills that I think have just been really bad, kind of grandstanding, that have moved forward. And of course, a lot of the attention was on constitutional carry or permitless carry in Texas. But he kept pushing forward on this, and I think he got one in under the radar. House Bill 957 would repeal, it's a 1-2 punch, its first two steps against NFA restrictions on firearms sound suppressors. Sitting on the governor's desk, waiting for a signature. We've asked, we're like, do you think he's going to sign it? And he says he thinks it's going to happen. We'll see in the next few days, I guess. But it repeals Texas code criminalizing owning a firearm, and I put in quotes in this report, silencer, because that's the term that everyone seems to use, but we really need to start pointing out that they're more accurately referred to as sound suppressors. Just a side note, outside of federal regulation. So the first step it does in this legislation is it repeals a state law, concurrent state law, with the federal restriction on sound suppressors. Then part 2, which is awesome, it also bans the state from enforcing any federal restrictions on suppressors that don't exist under state law. So they're basically taking a very narrow styled approach of what Arizona, Montana, Idaho, Missouri have done, and saying, if it's not on the books in the state, we're not going to enforce it, just on sound suppressors. But then at the same time, they're also recognizing that there's a sound suppressor restriction under state law, so they're repealing it. It's a 1-2 act in the same time. And I think they're able to pull that off because it's so narrow. But that's exactly what we need to see happen in Missouri in 2022, maybe specifically on suppressors. I'm not sure what motivates those of you in Missouri, what's most important to you, but I think a very narrow step like this would be just merely to go to section 571.020 and just delete out, have someone introduce a piece of legislation that deletes out this section, a firearm silencer. Gone. It's no longer in state law, so then they're no longer going to enforce the federal act as well. So House Bill 957 is sitting on Texas Governor Abbott's desk right now. It passed by a vote of 95 to 51 on the House side and 18 to 13 on the Senate side. In New Hampshire, Senate Bill 154, it's been passed by both the Senate and the House. Two totally different, well, not totally different versions. The state Senate passed legislation that would say that they're not going to enforce any executive order that restricts the right to keep and bear arms. The House actually expanded it. Usually what happens when you see a bill go through is it starts out, the strategy is start out with as much as you can get, like in Montana, and then you know they're always going to try to whittle it down, and you have some negotiating room. If you go too far, it doesn't go anywhere. If you go real far, they're going to talk to you about it, and then you kind of work a deal, and then you build up from there. In New Hampshire, for some strange reason, it started out as the most narrow thing, only addressing executive orders, but no laws on the books. And then it passed the Senate by a vote of 14 to 10, pretty tight, goes over to the state House, and they expand it to any federal act on the books that is not on the books in the state of New Hampshire, basically the same as the Arizona bill. And that passed very, very closely. It was a vote of 199 to 77. So it prohibits any the House version, which is the one we'd like to see get to the governor. I'm not sure. It'll probably be somewhere in between. They are in what's called a conference committee on the 16th to start hammering out what they want to do. Then what comes from the conference committee, whatever they come up with, which is kind of a combination or maybe a deal on this, then it goes to each chamber for them to vote on whether they approve that, and I think it can keep going through that process. It's a 2-year session in New Hampshire, so this could take some time. We'll see. So the legislation, as passed by the House, prohibits any political subdivision of the state and any person acting under the color of state, county, or municipal law from using any personnel or financial resources to enforce, administer, or cooperate with any law, act, rule, or regulation of the United States government or presidential executive order that is inconsistent with any state law regarding the regulation of firearms, ammunition, magazines, or ammunition feeding devices, firearm components, firearm supplies, or knives. Like, it's pretty broad. And what I like is that they included a very clear definition. It also stipulates that, quote, silence in the New Hampshire revised statutes annotated pertaining to a matter regulated by federal law shall be construed as an inconsistency for the purposes of this chapter. So if the feds have a law on the books and it says nothing about that same thing on state law, it's considered an inconsistency, and as passed by the House, Senate Bill 154 would ban the state from enforcing. We'll see what happens in the next few days, weeks, or months in New Hampshire. We'll certainly be reporting on it. And then in a surprise move in Wisconsin, they're taking a very similar approach to Montana. Assembly Bill 293 passed the state assembly by a vote of 61 to 36 last week, and it would ban enforcement of basically any new federal gun control. A good starting point, a line in the sand. So that is a good step forward. We'll be following that as well. I guess that pretty much covers it. Let me take a look over in the live chat and see if there's any questions that I can answer. Gabriel says, I'm going to have to re-listen to this since YouTube failed to notify me. Yes, that happens quite a bit. Missouri Liberty Alliance out there, good to see you as well. Appreciate you being here. Christian May says, I'd love to see a Preservation Act in Indiana. For some reason, Indiana is a really tough nut to crack. You'd think that this type of thing would go forward very easily. We've got a lot of people who are supportive of this type of thing in the grassroots, but it is very difficult in that state legislature. They are resistant to doing anything that defies Washington, D.C. I mean, California does it all the time. Why can't Indiana? They should be embarrassed by this. I mean, well, the good people of Indiana wanted to get it done, but they've got to push through these horrible politicians. Well, I hope you guys found this really interesting. I'll take a look in the live chat here in just a moment. I want to ask you, if you could, please smash the like button. Please leave a review on Apple Podcasts or any other podcast platform. Comments in the archives, subscribe, getting notifications. All that stuff triggers the algorithm of the platform, and it tells it to show the program to more people. So that really helps me out spreading the word to more people. I appreciate any help you can give on that. Of course, our membership program starts out as little as $2 a month. It's 10thamendmentcenter.com/members. I'm grateful for everyone who's given us your support. And if you can't, don't feel any obligation to do so. But if you do have the financial means, I'm very, very thankful for any consideration you can give. Taking a look a little further, Missouri Liberty Alliance says we need all states to get Second Amendment Preservation Act. There is power in numbers. That's exactly what James Madison told us in Federalist number 46, talking about what do you need to do to make sure that you are having that line in the sand, that separation of powers between federal and those reserved to the states and to the people, which is almost everything. Everything else is reserved to the states and to the people. In Federalist 48, he pointed out that just a mere demarcation on parchment, just putting words to paper, doesn't do the job. It was his follow-up. In 46, he told us what needs to be done. It was a 4-step plan, which was basically governors need to be outspoken against everything that the feds do. Governors are generally bad, so they've been coming kind of last on these types of things. But the people need to throw a hissy fit. They need to use legislative devices on a state level, and they need to use, in Madison's words, a refusal to cooperate with officers of the Union. That is exactly what's happening with the Second Amendment Preservation Act in Missouri. That's exactly what's happening on the similar legislation in Arizona and elsewhere. A refusal to cooperate with officers of the Union. And Madison said if several adjoining states took this approach, it would create an environment the federal government would hardly be willing to encounter. So Missouri Liberty Alliance, absolutely correct about that. The more that states take this action, the harder and harder it becomes for the federal government to force their so-called laws, regulations, and mandates down our throats. Liberty Revolutionary says they're called suppressors, but the ATF uses silencers in its regulation. If you use suppressor on Form 1 or 4, it won't, the forms are a problem. And we know that a lot of the federal gun control, that the enforcement actions that they do, a large percentage, I forget the number, but I did an episode on this, a lot of it is through form errors. They're prosecuting people for failing to file a form, filing a form wrong, filing it late, whatever. And that's, man, that is some tricky stuff. I mean, they really are suppressors, but in the media, they call them silencers. And I think that's a term of propaganda as well. Anyways, I will take a look in the chat a little bit later today. Please continue leaving comments, whether it's live or in the archive. I'm so grateful for the help in spreading the word, smashing the like, and the reviews on Apple Podcasts and elsewhere. That helps a ton. I hope you enjoyed this episode. I hope you learned something. I hope you're motivated to take action to push things forward in these states and elsewhere, whether it's step 1, step 2, or step 3. We got to keep the ball rolling. As Thomas Jefferson told us in a letter to the Reverend Charles Clay in 1790, he said, the ground of liberty is to be gained by inches. Brick by brick, we're setting the foundation for more in the future. Thanks again for being here. I hope you had a great weekend. I appreciate you kicking off your week with me, and I'll see you next time here on the Path to Liberty.